All right. Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Erik Martin and really excited to share this with you all today. So you might recognize some of these logos. Maybe you recognize them from clubs in your high school that you may have been a part of or just seen. Maybe your parents or grandparents were a member of one of these and you had a coffee mug floating around somewhere with one of these logos. Maybe you recognize them from Adopt a Highway signs, or plaques in hospitals, or notes on various fundraisers. But these are all secular organizations and what are referred to as chapter-based service clubs. Almost all are, at this point, truly international, with clubs around the world. And almost all of them were started around 100 years ago. At their peak, there were tens of millions of members who would meet locally on a weekly basis. And they were instrumental in some massive service projects like eradicating polio, and fighting poverty. And what I'm really interested in with these being 100 years or older is, what were the conditions? What was the situation 100 years ago that really led these to start? Why did the community builders of that time create these sort of chapter-based clubs? And what was it about them that allowed them to sustain and remain active until today? So their membership has declined in recent years. In the last 30 or so years, all of these clubs have seen declines, but they're all still active and relevant in their local communities, give or take. And around the world, in any sort of mid-sized city, on a weekly basis, you can find one of these clubs. And as a visitor or stranger to town, you can go in and meet people and find community, even if it's just for a weekly breakfast or a luncheon. And some of the largest organizations like Rotary or Lions still have over 1 million members, and have clubs meeting in over 200 countries around the world. So I want to talk about why they started and why they survived. And just to be clear up front, I'm not a historian. I'm obsessed with history and an amateur history buff, but I'm not a historian. I don't have a lot of firsthand knowledge of these organizations. I'm coming at this through the lens of a community manager. So I started in the community industry at Reddit. I was the first community manager there. Back in 2008. Reddit is almost 16 years old. There's plenty of Reddit users who are younger than the platform itself. And that seems pretty impressive and strange by today's standards. But even 15 years is not very long when you compare it with these organizations some of them have been around for 100, 120 years. So that's my lens as a community manager. And while all of these, many of these organizations have flaws, and they've been responsible for some impressive projects, and just their staying power has been impressive as well. So I'm really interested in what we as community builders today can learn from their longevity. So I want to save some time for questions at the end, and sorry for the late start. That was my fault on the technical difficulties. But if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat so you don't forget. And I'm try to save time at the end to answer some questions you might have. So a note about images. I didn't want to make you all stare at my face for 30 minutes. And I definitely didn't want to show some black and white old photos of the mostly white men who founded these service clubs 100 years ago. And I think old photos make them feel even more distant than they are. So I chose to show some of my favorite artworks, some of my favorite paintings from that time period. So these are all these are art that was created around the time that these clubs were started. And if you're in New York, most are not all, if not all of these are actually from the Brooklyn Museum. So if any speak to you, you can probably go see them in person if you're in New York. But I want, if you can imagine, just to kind of put it in perspective, how long these clubs have been around. If you can imagine the communities we're part of today, the communities working on, if you can imagine that, if you have children or might have children one day, if you think about, what it would feel like, what it would be like to have your children join the communities you're part of. And then if you can imagine having your grandchildren join those communities. And imagine that those communities, those groups you're a part of today, imagine after you're dead, your great-grandchildren, and maybe even your great-grandchildren could join those communities one day. After you're gone, after your children are gone, those communities still remain and are still relevant and are still accepting new members that might be your relatives, 100+ years from now. That's pretty impressive, especially when you consider what a different time these communities, these organizations were formed in. So these organizations were created about 100 years ago, a little after the turn of the century and around World War I. I'm obsessed with that period of history for a few reasons. One is because I feel like it's long enough ago that it's different, that it's foreign, that it's surprising, that you really have to sort of research and imagine what it's like. But it's recent enough that that's possible. I don't know, for me at least, anything much longer than 100, 150 years ago, I have trouble really imagining what it would be like for me. I have trouble putting myself in the shoes of people during that time. But 100 years ago, it's a stretch, but I can do it. So I really like that time for that reason. Another reason is because it was a time of huge change, technological change, societal change, cultural change. Just between 1900 and 1915, you had everything from Einstein's theory of relativity coming out, Marie Curie isolating radium, you had the invention of plastics, you had things like radios, electricity, telephones, mass media in the form of newspapers, all becoming relatively regular household items in the major cities. You had wages rise by 50% from just before the turn of the century to 1920. You had huge manufacturing power shift from the UK to the US. You had the rise of the middle class in the US. You had these major industrial cities really forming. So you had this massive technological change. You had massive societal change. People were moving in record numbers to these cities. They were moving away from their families. They were moving away from the sort of agrarian lifestyle that their parents and grandparents knew. On farms to this more industrial, more modern society. And one of the things that people did was they looked for community. So almost all of these service organizations, Rotary, Kiwanis, Lions, Junior League, they were all started by people who were newcomers to the cities. So, Rotary was started in Chicago by a lawyer who had just moved to town in 1905. He didn't know that many people. And he really wanted to create a group that he could join that could help him, in his business ambitions, that could help him meet new people socially, that could help him in his career, but also just, he really didn't know that many people. And so he decided to start something. I think a lot of us in the community space could relate to that either ourselves or see that in a lot of the members who are joining our communities, either for personal or professional reasons. So you have a lot of these young professionals who are interested in making the right contacts, interested in a chance to network, a chance to give back, and very similar to what we see today with people joining new communities. Another thing that's important is just the classification system and cross-pollination system. So this was something that was unique to Rotary and really created the framework for communities going forward. So this was something that was present from the very early days. So Rotary, the name Rotary actually comes from the fact that they rotated where they would meet. So in 1905, when they started, the founder was a lawyer. One of the other, founding 4 members, meaning the first 4 people who showed up, was a coal miner. Another one was a merchant tailor, and the other one was also involved. He was an engineer, and so you had people from different industries together, and they would rotate offices, rotate where they would meet. So that their insight early on was that they wanted it cross-pollination. They wanted people from different industries. They didn't want it to be dominated by any one individual, by any one industry, by any one company. And that was really important. And if you look at some of the groups that formed prior to sort of this Rotary and some of those early service clubs, they weren't able to expand beyond just being dominated by one industry in the town where or the city where they started, or one individual. So this format that they created was really key in making sure that Rotary could remain dynamic, and that it could really be a place where people could network with other business people and come together, even if they were working at competitors or working in rival industries. So this is something that was then replicated by a lot of the clubs that came after Rotary. And even today, the active membership in most of these clubs, that they're limited, so that you can't have too many members from one industry or one company, or one profession. So they really, they create some tensions, but they really want a mix of people from different industries and companies. Another thing that's I think super important to Rotary Success and the success of these service clubs across the board is the mix of local and sort of global missions. So, something like, again, these large service organizations, they all have their sort of, today, they all have their large global causes, big, ambitious, sort of universal projects that they're working on. So, Rotary was instrumental in eradicating polio. Kiwanis is focused on fighting poverty. Civitans, after the World Wars, was really focused on refugees, was then focused on encouraging voting. Quota was really focused on the deaf community. So a lot of these organizations have this sort of global cause that's sort of universal, and that they can really be ambitious and really try to, raise a lot of money and contribute a lot of hours and education around. Then they also have very local, very sort of grassroots arms as well. So if you are in a small town somewhere, and you have a nonprofit you're trying to get off the ground, or a fundraiser, or a charity cause, you can, if you know someone, you can get on the agenda at the weekly luncheon for any one of these organizations, and you can get 5 minutes to sort of give your case and talk about your cause, and maybe the club can write you a $100 or $250 check. So they really contribute on a local level as well. And I think it's this really important mix of both local, super grassroots, super targeted, super small, super intimate, combined with these big overarching universal sort of causes. So in terms of service, it really helps them sort of feel like they're part of something bigger, yet also feel like they're connected to their local community. The service organizations today, in modern times, about half of them are in what are considered rural or semi-rural communities. So that's one of the ways they've been able to adapt. They all started in cities, but with this combination of local and global service and sort of mission, they've been able to adapt not just to cities, but to smaller communities as well. Most of the chapters today have less than 50 people. Even though, again, some of the larger organizations have millions of total members, it's really spread out across small and medium-sized towns. Another big tension forming that was present even in the early days, and I think a lot of us in community can relate to, is the tension between commerce and social or service-oriented desires. So early on, the mission of Rotary was really more around business, around networking, around these people developing their careers, but they really even after about the first 5 or 6 years, as it started to grow and spread to other cities, they realized, okay, that's not that's not going to do it. That's not going to be enough to sustain even, in their careers as they grew. And they decided to kind of focus more on adding in a service element, right? On making the actual like charter of the organization focused on service, focused on giving back, focused on some of these causes. So they really focused on the service element, and even that wasn't enough. So a lot of the other large organizations, Civitans, Lions, Kiwanis, actually grew out of Rotary. So members of early Rotary chapters in their local towns felt that the focus of Rotary was too focused on the commerce, too focused on the business. So they started kind of their own version of it that was slightly different and focused entirely on service. So that was something that was a tension early on. And I think that's kind of a tension on some level with communities. In general, there's has to be, or there's often a need, some commercial element, making money, sustaining the costs, the companies behind it. There's some tension there between that and the sort of, genuine desires and sincere goals to give back or to contribute towards a cause. And I think that tension, can cause problems, but obviously I think it also helps make communities dynamic. So navigating those tensions, for those of us in the industry that can relate, that's nothing new. And people were dealing with it, way back in 1915 as well. I want to touch on another big issue here before we have time for questions here, and that's retention. So if you've worked in communities for any length of time, I don't have to tell you about the problem, the challenge, the never-ending puzzle that is retention. So with these organizations, again, they're down from their peaks. In the 70s and 80s, and they're down from their peaks. But if you really look at the problem, if you really look at the challenges they're facing, it's not necessarily a recruitment problem. If you dig into the numbers, the clubs are recruiting plenty of new members, even though the average age has gone up in recent decades. The problem they're facing is retention. So even though they've lasted 100 plus years, they're losing about 5% of their members a year, and they're only adding 4%. So over time, that's where you get the massive declines. If you're familiar with Bowling Alone, if you read that book that came out in the early, I think in 2000, they talk a lot about the decline in organizations, sort of civic organizations like these service clubs. And there's lots of macro and micro reasons for that. But if you just look at it from a data point of view, and as community managers, the problem, whatever the underlying cause, is retention. And if you go in and read a lot of the sort of blogs and articles and discussions that members and leaders are having today, they're talking retention. They're saying how do we manage the tension between the leaders of both the global organizations and the local chapters, who are elected for 1-year term and have short-term numbers they need to hit, with addressing the longer-term underlying causes that lead to losing members, that lead to retention issues over time. So that's something I definitely like for you all to take away, that these organizations that have been able to sustain 4 generations, that ultimately, what's really, over time causing, their number and their influence to dwindle is retention. Retention in communities is, it's kind of boring. It's maybe not too exciting. I think of it sort of like heart disease. It's not the most alarming thing, but statistically, it's probably what will kill you. Right. So same with heart disease. So this problem of long-term retention, again, no matter how dynamic, no matter how woven you are into the local communities, in the case of some of these sort of service organizations, if you have 1% more members leaving than joining, over time you'll have real problems, right? You'll dwindle in size. The other thing I just want to have you all take away from this, from learning about these organizations, is that it's possible, right? The founders of these groups, when they started 100 years ago, and it's pretty clear from looking at some of the early history, they never intended, they never imagined that these would last 100 years. They never imagined that they would have chapters all over the globe. They weren't, they weren't experts in the field of organizing or creating, organizations or community building. And they weren't even that successful in their fields, but they were able to build something that lasted after they were gone, after their kids were gone, and in some cases after their grandkids were gone. So I just want to encourage all of you community builders now, whether you've been doing it for a while or whether you're just getting started, that it is possible. These people who created communities back then, for a variety of reasons, they're not smarter than any of you. They're not, in many ways they have less tools, less resources than some of us with some of the tools we have at our disposal today. But I hope someone out there listening maybe is able to create communities that can outlast all of us. So that's one thing I'm excited by after learning about some of these communities. So if anyone has any questions or anything you want to share in the chat, I got a minute or two here, but otherwise, appreciate you all letting me share this recent fascination of mine with you. Yeah, and encourage you all to check out, some of these, how some of these communities show up, what they're like in your local towns or cities. Just kind of see how they're, what are they doing online? How have they adapted or not? And what are they like? It's really interesting. And I think as community builders, we can learn a lot from what they're doing. That's both the things that are successful or things that need some work as well.